Today is the final day of the 7-day Hodlonaut versus Craig Wright trial here in Oslo, Norway. Myklebust and Haukus concluded the closing statements before the first break. The remainder of the day was Manhouse and Helly delivering the closing statements for Craig Wright. During the closing statements, Manhouse cited all of the major arguments that had been highlighted throughout the case, and Helly went through all of the witnesses that had come to testify for Craig Wright. After Manhouse concluded, the judge permitted Haukus time for a rebuttal. Haukus did an additional 40 minutes of rebuttal, and then Myklebust had a few clarifying points as well. During the 40-minute rebuttal, Craig was scribbling furiously and ripping pages very loudly, passing them to Helly. Then the judge went back to Manhouse and said that he could have an additional 40 minutes, which he did not take. The last part of the day, the judge went over the court costs and the timeline for the ruling. In the discussion of the court costs, Haukus objected because Craig Wright's fees are almost double what Hodlonaut's legal fees are. After the discussion about the court costs, the judge permitted 2.5 weeks for Manhouse to settle all of their court expenses, but with the agreement that the BDO and cipher expenses would be sent in the following days to Haukus. As to the ruling, the judge said the 8th of November. It might be ready before then, but she will give a 1-day notice to both parties before the ruling is announced. We will keep you up to date as we get more information about the ruling. That's it for this 7-day court case. Thanks for tuning in.
We are now joined by our reporter on the ground, Mills. Welcome back to Bitcoin Magazine Live.
Thank you so much for having me. This is the last day of being a reporter, This is it.
While we do have you, as the recap showed, we did hear Craig Wright's team's closing statements, and of course on Monday we heard Hodlonaut's team's closing statements as well. I want to just sort of back up to Monday. Off of the heels of Hodlonaut's closing statements, did the court today start with any surprises or anything to carry over from Monday, or did they just dive right into Craig Wright's testimony?
So the first pre-break, so like around 90 minutes of the day, was actually wrapping up of the Hodlonaut closing statements. So there was a little bit more that Myklebust was in the middle of presenting, and then it shifted over, and then both Helly and Manhouse were doing the full closing. And it was a very different vibe in court, I would say, today. There was a lot of energy on Monday, and it did not feel that same way today. And I talked to a couple people that have been throughout this case, afterwards, and everyone kind of felt that same. It was a long day. It was heavy, and a lot of, we've heard the same arguments, the Andreessen signing, the Sartre blog post, that we've heard a lot of these same things over and over, and a lot of the same documents, and it was very much a recap of everything yet again. That it just felt long. Felt like a long day.
No, it's been a long week and a half, to say the least. And with things wrapping up, do you mind sharing with us, how did Craig's team frame their closing remarks? We heard a lot from Hodlonaut's team framing it around the fight for freedom of speech, citing the Constitution here over there in Norway, and just highlighting the importance of what this case holds. How did Craig's team approach that their closing remarks?
Yeah, a lot of the argument initially was built on saying that Hodlonaut had this platform and has this, access to all of these people, kind of saying how influential these tweets really were. And then the next part of the argument was talking about media and, there was an acknowledgement that it is in the media's rights to criticize and to question. And then there was a lot of, well, is someone in the public sphere or in the private sphere? And a lot of previous cases in different countries all over the world that have involved defamation were cited as evidence and references and compared with the specific laws in Norway. But it was interesting because then, after kind of saying that Hodlonaut had this amazing platform and was this spokesperson, then it was an argument that he is not a media watchdog and is not a reporter and is not a journalist and is not, protected under those guidances. And then it went back to saying, but then he's very famous on Bitcoin Twitter, and Jack Dorsey's name repeatedly brought up of how much influence and access he had. So I felt a little whiplash as I'm synthesizing all of this information. It felt like there was an argument that he was really pivotal, and then that he wasn't really pivotal, and then he was a real voice. So I don't know what the strategy was there, and maybe that was my assessment. Like, as you know, I'm listening to the court translators that are anyone that's in the courtroom can listen to these headsets, and it's translated into English. And I'm also sitting next to a translator that is not listening to that and translating from Norwegian into English. And we're kind of just time stamping and going through each of the points. So I at least have two different inputs to synthesize between, but there were definitely some moments where it felt like I lost the plot a little bit about the arch of the argument and kind of what was trying to be pulled or crafted. And then a lot of emphasis was placed on all of the witnesses that Craig Wright's team had called, and also a lot of effort to kind of discredit the documentary evidence, and saying the KPMG report was invalidated by BDO and by CIFOR, and it felt a little like everything that had been presented mostly on Monday in the closing of Hodlonaut's team was then pretty directly refuted. So then when it went back to Haukus to do a rebuttal, there was definitely a lot of, I guess, pointing out that there was this push and pull, and it just kind of felt like a bit of a messy day logically, if that makes sense.
It does. It almost it seems as though there's certain angles that Craig Wright's team is trying to play. I'm assuming that during these closing remarks, the judge is no longer asking any more questions, or were there any more questions from the judge to get further clarity before she goes to make her determination?
There really weren't a lot of additional questions that the judge was posing. It wasn't until the final discussion between both parties that the judge was mediating about court costs. And that was something that was brought up in the final closing of Hodlonaut's lawyers this morning. And then that's pretty much how the Craig Wright closing as well went, that neither party thinks that they should be responsible for the court costs. So there is, because in this case, Hodlonaut is the plaintiff and Craig Wright is the defendant, because, this was a reactionary case called by Hodlonaut in reply to the letter, the serving that he received from Craig Wright before all of this kind of started unraveling and unfolding. So both parties basically said, yeah, we shouldn't be responsible. Our client should not be responsible for the financial burden of this. So I'm not sure if there's precedent for, I don't know exactly how it's going to go with this case. If there's a way that the judge says, okay, everyone's responsible for their own court case fees, or I'm not sure what the options are with the ruling, but there wasn't a final number presented by Craig Wright's team that involved the fees that were paid to BDO and to CIFOR. So Manshaus has a couple days to get that to Haukus, and then they will both know the full fees. But more or less, it's double. It's around double Craig Wright's fees versus Hodlonaut's fees. I mean, 10 lawyers versus 2. But it will be interesting to see kind of how this ends up. And I would say it's a little over $1 million estimated of Craig Wright's fees, but we'll hopefully know those numbers in the next week or two. The judge said October 7th for final court fees to be submitted to her.
And so, as we also heard, the determination should be made no later than November 8th. Can we talk a little bit about what the expected timeline is? Pretty much from now until then, my assumption is everyone is just going to have to hang tight while this judge reviews everything she's heard over the last week and a half before finally making this determination.
Yeah, and she said that it could be sooner. And she said typically it's a couple weeks, but that's not what is going to happen with this case. And she did say that there will be a day notice given to both parties before, and then also an hour preparation on the day of the ruling being announced, that both parties will also have time so they can prepare their statements. And it felt, she's definitely trying to make everyone be as involved in this timeline as possible. But it does seem that she doesn't think it's going to just be a quick decision that she's going to just come up with. It sounds like she's given herself enough time to be certain that she will have the ruling by that date. But it didn't sound like, yeah, and for sure it will be sooner. It sounds like maybe there's a chance that it does happen earlier than November 8th.
So let's unpack a little bit more of today's conversation from Craig's team. From what I've been able to gather from your reporting, both on Twitter as well as our discussion here, it seems as though rather than the technical components of Craig Wright's validity to his claim, their argument is more so around Hodlonaut having done something right or wrong, and the degree in which his actions are deemed right or wrong seem to be how, for lack of a better way of putting this, how famous does the judge think he is on the pedigree of the Bitcoin ecosystem? Is that an appropriate summation of like Craig Wright's essentially team stance at this point?
Yeah, it does feel like they've built a strong argument saying that this is why this is very defamatory and damaging to Craig Wright's business and his, both to Enchain, both to BSV, like that it is very damaging. There was a lot of emphasis placed on whether or not Craig is a public figure, and there was some discussion about when he came forward as Satoshi, and then also that it wasn't his preference. A lot of that was cited as well. It feels as though there is the burden of the argument is on the witnesses that are basically vouching. And in my opinion, I think Haukus could have gone a lot harder. Maybe I don't understand, why he didn't, but a lot of the witnesses are financially involved with Craig Wright in business, or have been in the past, or are still in some capacity. So it did feel like most of his witnesses were, there was a family member, there were people that are currently on the board of his company. So there were a lot of connections with the witnesses. And that was something that Manshaus actually brought up, saying that Hodlonaut's witnesses were kind of all expert witnesses and they're all into Bitcoin, even though some of the witnesses aren't, Bitcoin maximalists. There was definitely, these witnesses are much more already in this world. They're already a part of whether, Bitcoin Twitter. And each of them was asked, like, did you see this tweet? To which none of them, really were like, yeah, I saw these or whatever. They didn't really say that they had seen them, and then also did say they probably wouldn't have retweeted or, said that themselves. But that was more the argument that was taking place. Whereas with a lot of the witnesses that Craig Wright's team called, it was both to vouch for his technical ability and his personal confrontational, and autism came up again, the discussion of, is it a mental illness, and Hodlonaut not being aware of his actual diagnosis at the time of these tweets, that was another thing brought up. But it's not necessarily how famous Hodlonaut was or wasn't. It is under what motivation and purpose were these tweets sent out. And the Bitcoin Plebs group on Telegram was brought up again, and Manshaus was talking about the, different things that were talked about in there, showing slides, screenshots of this Telegram group. But when there was the rebuttal, Hawkes was able to say, there's no, this is all hearsay, this is all conjecture, because there's no evidentiary proof that Hodlonaut was actually in that group, and the screenshots that are citing him make it actually much more likely that he wasn't, because there are people in this group that were talking about helping him out or joining in, being a part of what he was doing, which would have seemed a little weird if he was actually in that Telegram group specifically. And Manshouse was citing that this group was, to elicit violent behavior against the BSV, to launch an attack, to be a specific target. So I think more so than Hodlonaut's clout and like place within the space, it is the intention, and it is the whether or not he was doing this for just his own, or bringing, attacking Craig Wright and bringing his name down, or if it was in the intention of protecting the public against someone that he saw as, a potential threat that people could be misled by. That if he's more of a whistleblower that is saying, hey, this is really something you should be aware of, versus this person's terrible. And a lot of, the there was a lot of acknowledgement that Craig Wright does not only use kind words himself on Twitter. And so there was much acknowledgement that these are defamatory tweets, in the sense that they are criticizing Craig Wright and his character and who he is. They're not kind tweets. That's not really debated, but it's on how seriousness and at what level they can be judged. And there is more protection under freedom of speech to criticize, an idea than there is a person specifically. So, and then there's also different parameters if you're more of a journalist or a media or blogger that is looking out for, your community, than if you're just an individual kind of going head to head.
This really is, and I know we've kind of talked about this, but this really does feel like a David and Goliath court case. And the framing of some of these conversations, it's a little worrisome. I have to admit that I think just some of the things that are being said in this courtroom and the weight that they carry in the broader context of Bitcoin and just the broader ecosystem, it'll be interesting to see what the decision will be and how I think future court cases will be impacted by whatever is decided here in Oslo. Do you have a sense of, excuse me, when Craig Wright's next lawsuit is set to begin and where that would be?
Well, I don't know if there's something between now and then, but there is a hearing of sorts it's like the next step for the Hodlonaut Craig Wright case in the UK, scheduled for December. So it was actually brought up today, and the judge said, this decision is about this decision, and this isn't necessarily regarding all the other cases that are happening. But I believe it was Manshouse that said, this is global. There's other cases, and this ruling will also impact those. And the judge really confirmed that this is the Norwegian court. This is this case specifically, and she's focused on this ruling in particular. And the big distinction between this Norwegian court case and the UK case, Hodlonaut brought this case, and it includes 9 tweets over 4 days. The case in the UK has been whittled down to 1 tweet, I believe, and it is brought by Craig Wright. So this was the initial, what started all of this. And there were actually, and I know it's been mentioned before, but Manshouse again said, there was no attempt to have a civil conversation and reconcile after Craig had sent Hodlonaut the letter. That, Hodlonaut instead sought legal counsel in the UK. They said, delete the tweets, hopefully it'll go away. It did not go away. And then he brought the legal suit in Norway. But there Manshaus says, there was room for an amicable resolution. They could have talked about it. And something that was interesting today too, since I don't know the exact date that Craig Wright's Twitter was deleted, but they said that Craig Wright had no way of replying or commenting to these tweets, which in the rebuttal, Mickelbust actually clarified that that was wrong, that Craig Wright did still have a Twitter and he could have commented and he could have replied and he could have engaged and they could have discussed these tweets as well. So it seems like, that there is an acknowledgement that this could have maybe not gone to the court so quickly, but I think also there's precedent and there's knowing that Craig Wright is very litigious. I don't know that having a conversation seemed like it would be a welcome or a possible outcome, an opportunity for resolution.
I find it so fascinating that the judge specifically said that this decision will not carry or should be considered independent of any of these other court cases, given how many other court cases there actually are, which I think personally should be a factor in just any decision being made around this. I will remain, I think, optimistic and hopeful that should a decision fall in favor of Hodlonaut, that will in turn be, look favor reflect favorably upon the upcoming court case in the UK.
And she wasn't saying that it wouldn't, but that's not a part of this case. So
Right.
as in her decision.
Right. So I'm going to then take that as saying she's not necessarily considering the fact that Craig Wright is suing just about anyone that he sees fit who says something he doesn't like. That's not a part of this.
Well, I don't think there's a way it could not be a part of this in some degree, because so much of the evidence, the A bundle, the B bundle, so much of these documents cite previous legal cases, previous testimonies, previous witnesses. So it's very implied that there have been many previous cases, and the Florida case was discussed and brought up multiple times. So there's really no way that she could avoid that there were other court cases that have been a part of this, that there's a legacy of other trials before this. So I don't know that there's any way to ignore that. However, it does seem that she's really trying to look at this situation specifically. And even though the McCormick case was brought up a few times and there were some specifics that were also used from the McCormick evidence that, that were cited as well, it doesn't feel as if this is, hey, let's draw the parallels, let's see, and even how that ruling went. I think, Manshaus was like, well, and Craig won this case against McCormick, but when in reality, the ruling was for £1 and doesn't mean that that's all the costs associated with that decision, because legal fees are also much more than £1. However, it does feel like the judge isn't trying to draw parallels beyond exactly what this situation is and exactly what has gone down within Hodlonaut and Craig Wright's interactions on Twitter.
And I want to first start with Hodlonaut's team. We've obviously had the opportunity to speak to them. How was their team? Were they in good spirits? Did they feel optimistic as the court session today ended and the week and a half long trial has come to an end?
Yeah, I had a phone call with Hodlonaut after the case, and he's relieved. Yeah, and to be honest, it is hard to know exactly how this ruling is going to go, and just has to kind of not think about it for a little while and recover from this very long, grueling, and high energy investment of a process. He said, after his testimony, it felt like that was kind of the biggest hurdle, because he's never been involved in a court case before. So it's hard. I mean, even going into this, it's hard to know exactly what to expect and how it's going to go and what the procedures are. And for me, I've only been in American court, so this is a totally different dynamic and style of judiciary systems. But I think his big, like, he loved all of the support. There were numerous local Bitcoiners and not so local Bitcoiners that came and spent a day or some the whole trial, but would come by and be there and show their support for him. And also just the support from the online community that Bitcoin Twitter is, that he's had. You know, there's still a lot of Space Cat avatars out in the wild. And I think just feeling that support and feeling that solidarity has been a huge impact, even just for morale and keeping spirits high. And he also wanted to thank Bitcoin Magazine for reporting. And that was something Matt brought up on Monday, which I guess maybe I'm a little too close right now. I've been a little too close to this case for a little while, but this is a different precedent being set that CoinGeek or any of the kind of more Calvin and Craig loyal reporting aren't the only ones covering this or submitting. And I mean, as much as I'm sure, and it will continue, a lot of criticisms that I'm not impartial, and I'm not saying there isn't, you know, some more affiliation on one side. However, you know, there isn't a financial investment, and that's a big difference. But he Hodlonaut just was very thankful and very grateful for the support that the community has really shown, and that Bitcoin Magazine has been sharing this. And we are working at getting, hopefully we can get some of the witness testimonies as well. The biggest hurdle is that, as previously mentioned, the whole thing was pretty much in Norwegian, and it does take a lot of time to translate. We are very close to being done with subtitles for Hodlonaut's witness testimony. So we will update that on that testimony is already live on our YouTube, but we will work to put those subtitles as soon as we have that finished file. And then we will also be working to do the closing statements, both from Manshaus and Haukus. So we are working to continue to give the viewer the ability to draw your own conclusions, watch the whole trial. I mean, it's been more or less, you know, 8-ish hours for 7 days. So it's been a lot of footage, a lot of talking, and a lot of back and forth. But we will continue working at getting more of the actual footage from the court out. And as I think we've discussed previously, you know, we've shared this footage with any of the other media companies that have applied to utilize this, because the way the Norwegian court worked when they selected Bitcoin Magazine to be the winner of the press pool, we now are holding all of that footage. We were the ones that were permitted to film, but with the stipulation that we share that with anyone that applies and works within the parameters of the court. And you know, we as at Bitcoin Magazine are trying to protect Hodlonaut's identity per his wishes, but I am sure that there will probably be different best practices observed by different media publications.
I'm biting my tongue because there's a lot of things I want to say that need to be left unsaid, but I do need to ask and remind everyone. While we do cover Bitcoin Magazine, we have been speaking at length to Hodlonaut's team. We have reached out to Craig Wright's team to no avail. They have not responded to us for a request to interview. In fact, they've just been, Mills, correct if I'm wrong, kind of punting it, sending us to documentary people, essentially avoiding any and all of our requests. So we have
Well,
it.
I'll clarify.
Please.
I reached out to the documentary people because I've been in touch with them, and they forwarded to Craig's PR company. But the documentary, they have exclusive rights to Craig Wright and to his story. And so that's kind of why I went that way. So then I did hear back from the PR company, and they said, you know, Monday was the holiday in the UK for the Queen's funeral. So I don't know if that was just everything kind of working against. But no, we were not able to have an interview with Craig Wright, but did discuss with the team to, at least that was attempted. That was definitely attempted.
I'm going to say this off of what Mills said earlier, and then Mills, I will cede the floor to you for final words. We have done everything in our effort to protect the identity of Hodlonaut as we would any student, any NIM that wants an opportunity to be or share their ideas publicly. This unfortunately has not been the case across other media platforms that have been covering this trial. As someone who calls myself an armchair journalist, candidly, that's a disgusting act to dox someone in that way. I urge you, if you see footage like this, to report it. This is for the protection of someone and their family. And any act to ignore such requests, any attempt to just act as though it's acceptable to dox someone who has gone out of their way to not, that is an aggressive act. That is an aggressive act.
And there was actually a lot of discussion in court, both from mostly from Manshaus, a little bit from the judge, that like it's too late. That was kind of their assessment of, he can't, like, Hodlonaut doesn't really have the freedom at this point to choose that he is private, partly by going through with this case. But I do think, to your point, there's a difference between making it, like there's still a way that we can protect our comrade, like there is still a way to really honor. And all of the interviews, all of the things that we are posting with Hodlonaut, we're blurring his face and censoring his real name. But it is hard because based on the agreements, like all of that footage has his name and his face, and by going through with this trial in this court, that is legally out there now. So I love your passion, and we are doing our best as a publication to really respect his wishes. And obviously, still, I know his name. I still call him Hodlonaut as a sign of respect to that,
Absolutely. It is exactly that. It's a sign of respect. I as well have learned Hodlonaut's name during this process, and I have no reason to ever say it. And it's arrogant too. And I think you're a disgusting person if you think that it's acceptable to dox someone. But that's just me, because it's getting out of hand out there, and we're still human beings. So don't forget that.
And I mean, I had a little joke with him after the trial of, how now I'm a court reporter, and I basically doxed my face more or less for this case to be able to spread awareness. And I've been technically went face public in April, but nothing to the degree of my face that is now out there attached to Mills as my name. So it has been, in the seeking to continue to protect the people that this is their wish. So it was a worthwhile cause for me. I think this case, I don't know, I hope there isn't another case like this. I hope this could be the one that is the deciding factor. But I've learned a lot about the BSV crowd. I've learned a lot about, the other factors at play throughout this. I'm really excited to have a little time to continue to process on everything that has just gone down. But what a week and a half, truly.
Mills, I just want to once again thank you for all of your work and reporting on the ground. A special shout out to Pleb Music, who has also been behind the scenes helping to cut up all of these videos. Thank you to both of you for all of your hard work out there.